Let's get to it. Hopefully you are all enjoying this increasingly more complex video series as we started out with the basic king and pawn ending ideas that everyone needs to understand, not just to play king and pawn endings and evaluate the more complex ones that we're getting to, but also to play other end games. You know, evaluating every trade, any sort of transition or evolution of a position that you're in. A healthy and solid knowledge of king and pawn endings can really increase your ability to evaluate accurately when you're calculating things if you have a better idea of what's coming. So that's the purpose of our series here, continuing to master king and pawn endings and improve our knowledge, and welcome once again. So here we're looking at a position that is very tricky, one of my favorite positions in regards to the more advanced king and pawn ending ideas, whether we call it irregular opposition, corresponding squares, some distant opposition, although right now the kings are pretty close. At some point here you'll see they start to separate. But like we did in stage 3, I believe, where we did more problem solving, I really would suggest that everyone take a moment if they want to evaluate this position. It is white to play here. Obviously, I don't need to tell you you're trying to win, because if you wanted to draw, you could just agree to it right now. You're up a pawn, right? Let's all take that in for a second. So you're up a pawn, so what you're trying to do is try to win. And I would really urge you to pause it, and I want to give some further reasons for that. It's not just because we have nothing to do here at chess.com but ask our members to pause their videos, like we really enjoy that. It's because your ability to really soak in this information and for it to really become a part of your application, because there's always a transition from learning things to actually being able to apply it, is oftentimes based on how hard you apply yourself during studying and during the practice on your own time, right? That practice makes perfect phrase is kind of misleading unless you treat your practice like it matters. So please pause your video, take a moment to evaluate this endgame, and tell me what you think. Okay, so hopefully you pause your video and you're back. This is a very tricky position. White's ability to make progress on the king side is sort of stunted right now, based on the fact that he really doesn't have very much space, right? When you're dealing with a corner pawn and the two files here, as far as the knight and the rook file, you have limited maneuvering space. We'll say that. So white can try to beat his head against a brick wall as long as he needs to, right? A lot of players enjoy that, right? Just beating your head against a brick wall. White can do that, but even pushing the pawn is not going to do anything. There's no triangulation here. There's no sort of opposition tricks. Eventually, you may just push the pawn forward and find that you're not going anywhere. So, calculating variations where you're beating your head against the H-file brick wall is not going to get you anywhere. So, hopefully, you've applied some of the knowledge in the endgames that we've already done previously, and you understand that white may have the ability to remaneuver the king and perhaps head via the center or queen side, I guess that direction, over around to the f-pawn. Now, it's very tricky because any sort of obvious transfer of the king allows the enemy king to be active, right? We play some sort of simple moves. Let's go with the most direct line. Black actually has the ability to come to g5 rather than h4, right? If you calculated variations where he simply ignorantly goes after your h-pawn, he's going to lose. But hopefully some of you kept in mind the king dance position, which I believe we did in stage 2, which is really that beginning position, as I said, a middle ground position, trying to show you the beginning concepts of corresponding squares. And the corresponding squares here being e4 and g5. If white ever goes to e4 and black is able to go to g5, white cannot win this anymore. Obviously, if you continue to move forward, you're going to lose this pawn, and even a sacrifice of the h-pawn doesn't do anything. In fact, because black will not be dumb enough to take g5, giving you zugzwang in the irregular opposition, he'll make a waiting move, forcing you to take the square you don't want to, and now he'll win the pawn. I guess white's last chance would be to realize that he had blundered and come back, and ironically, because his position was so good to start, he can actually lose the pawn but still draw the endgame by achieving standard defensive opposition. So, a simple maneuver or trying to transfer your king over is not going to work. You have to figure out the right timing, find perhaps some sort of way to use the h-pawn as a decoy so that you can achieve your goal of eventually coming around. How does white do that? Well, it's awfully fun and super exciting to see. Okay, silly rabbit, tricks are for kids. We're about to be little kids here and see some cool tricks. All right, here we go. After king h4, king to g7, you're playing king h4 not to beat your head against the brick wall, but actually to improve your position via triangulation. The king goes to g3, and after the king comes back to h6, you head back to g4. Well, boys and girls, we have the same position we started with, but what's the difference? It is now black to move. Okay, so real quick, we see that again. We see the reason why we call this a triangulation is because we are forming a shape of a triangle when we draw arrows between these three squares. Now we're in the same position and black must retreat. So black moves his king back to either one of these squares. It doesn't really matter because you can't gain opposition by coming forward. So he moves to one of these squares. Now what was the purpose here of this idea? We can now start to come over without worrying about his king coming up directly. There are actually two moves that win here. Both king f4 and king f3 win, but king f3 is perhaps the most logical to prove the point of corresponding squares. The idea is very specific. You have only one move here that wins. You can repeat the position. You can also make some silly moves like king g3 and let him come up, or you could do the move as I first said that was a mistake, which would allow him to come forward. But there is one move that actually makes progress here, and it's a recognition of the corresponding squares. We're going to talk about how you can do this in your games in a second. The move is king to e3, double exclamation. The idea is pretty simple. If he goes to g5, I want to go to e4 when it's his move. I don't want my king on e4 and king on g5 with my move. So recognizing that those two squares are critical, knowing that I need to go to e4 only after he's gone to g5, so that if I go to e4, he'll have to move, and then I can make progress, right? So by going king to e3, black plays king to h5, avoiding this square because he's a smart cookie, and we continue to make progress, avoiding the critical square. King to d4, another exclamation. What's just happened here? We started out with a triangulation, and then avoided the critical squares, but still made progress toward the f-pawn. Black's best move now is to come back to g5, forcing us to take the square that we could have gone to for the last few moves, but only doing so when the timing was right. The king must now move. He can go after the h-pawn if he wants. He can do whatever he wants, in fact. We're winning the endgame. So when you look at this trick here, this is a very common. Triangulation is not just a way to make progress moving forward aggressively. Triangulation can be a way to lose time yourself, right? You're achieving the same position you already currently have, except your opponent is with the turn to move, not yourself. As I said, the three daddies of king and pawn endings, I said the three most advanced concepts are triangulation, flanking, and corresponding squares, which corresponding squares is kind of everything at once. You're kind of always calculating corresponding squares, which is simply a recognition like, okay, if my opponent goes there, I need to go to that square. So doing it at a basic level, you're already doing that concept. But as the positions become more complicated, it becomes harder to dictate or at least calculate the corresponding squares. So how do you do that here? Well, the first set of corresponding squares usually it comes from a goal. You can't really know where you're headed unless you have a goal. So if you do recognize that you're not going to achieve anything here, hopefully before you've pushed this pawn and blown your win. But if you do recognize that you're not going to achieve anything here, and you recognize your goal of coming around, you already see that these two are corresponding squares because of your knowledge of king and pawn endings. You know that when you go there, he's going to go there, right? Or vice versa. One player is going to go there first. Those are corresponding squares, and depending on whose move it is will be critical, right? So first you're recognizing is the squares. Whether you can dictate whose move it is or not, you'll have to calculate that. But you have to recognize the goal. Those two squares are corresponding. Then you see that in order to make progress, you also have to avoid this square until after he's taken the g5 square himself, because otherwise he gets it with your move. So you start calculating things, but it's easy to backtrack when you have a goal, right? So you keep avoiding the critical squares because you know what you're trying to do. You wouldn't be able to find tricky moves like this unless you knew your goal, first of all, and you also wouldn't understand that you needed to avoid certain squares along the way unless you understood corresponding squares. So it is tricky, and you can watch this a few times, and hopefully I didn't talk too fast or go over everybody's head, but I think watching these videos step by step, you're sort of building your muscles, and everyone should be able to stay with this. It's something I personally struggled with a lot. When I did king and pawn endings, I always wanted to break things down. Like you hear people say the concept like the box method, calculate the box, and you always want to make it basic, like a basic opposition idea. But at a certain point, you just can't do that until you've built an intuition. And so really, I always say, have a healthy fear of king and pawn endings. If you're ready to calculate this and you really go as far as you can figure out a lot of things just by concrete calculation. And over time, you do start to recognize new patterns. So we're going to set up another one here, another advanced one that I would like you to try to solve. Okay, and this is another advanced one. This one is more of a defensive advanced opposition idea, but another position I would like you to try to solve. Uh, okay, this position is white to play. You can go ahead and pause your videos. Okay, and hope you're back. So this is a tricky position. The kings are on, several squares distant from each other. We have this typical 3-square distance. Calculating obvious moves with the king, you see that your opponent will come forward and start munching your pawns, obviously before your king can reach defensive squares. But many people might calculate, oh, well, I can make a waiting move and get opposition, because just by maintaining the distant opposition, even if he munches, we're still drawing this position. Unfortunately, with your enemy pawn not having moved yet, he can simply make a waiting move of his own, and he's right back in Candyland, where he's happy. Right now, he's just won the opposition, and the pawn will go marching on. So coming forward and getting, even if you maintain the distant opposition with a strong move like king to g1, it doesn't make a difference when your opponent has a potential waiting move. So most of the students I've given this to stay stuck calculating that without recognizing one important factor. If the structure was irrelevant and your opponent did not have a waiting move, white already has distant opposition in this situation. So white's drawing method is actually a very strong move, g6, exclamavage. You sacrifice the enemy pawn. He can capture two ways. King takes is pretty obviously why it's pretty obvious for us to see why that's a draw. He's losing time, and our king can come up and draw. However, taking with the pawn is a little bit trickier because he's still threatening to make progress, and we're still in a situation where making a waiting move and gaining distant opposition is irrelevant to our cause. He has a waiting move. So sacrificing one pawn is not sufficient. We must sacrifice another. Exclamavage once again. You actually have baited this pawn to a less happy square, just a square that eliminates the idea of making a waiting move. So now, the fact that you have maintained distant opposition, you're simply going to go back and forth, and eventually he will come forward and give you that opposition, and black no longer has the ability to make a waiting move. By pushing the pawn forward equal to the king, we know we're in a drawn endgame. You start to see that your ability to figure out tricky positions like this is basically dead in the water if you haven't watched the first few videos and haven't made an effort to really commit those concepts and those patterns to memory. Because if you don't know, like I know by heart, that if my opponent's pawn is equal to or in front of the king, I know that this is a draw. I just know it. I don't need to calculate it. Okay? And I've been in a lot of situations where players who were good calculators, even 1900, 2000 level USCF, even sometimes higher, spend a lot of time calculating those things, and they end up spending tons of time on their clock calculating this type of endgame all the way to the end, which is sort of nuts because you really shouldn't have to. So not only is that a risk in a practical game to get yourself under that kind of time pressure, but it's really just something that if you've done the right work and really built your muscles in king and pawn endgame principles, you shouldn't have to do it. So you got to know that if he has to push his pawn forward, this position is an easy draw. The basic concept, we simply come straight back from the pawn, waiting to get opposition on either entry by the king. Either entry by the king, we gain opposition, and the position always leads to a forced stalemate. Okay, and then our final position here. This is one that is personally fun to me because it was a game that I played. I'm white in this position against a strong FIDE master. At the time, we were both FIDE masters, although I believe that he is also an international master by now. A young player, I think, maybe just a little bit older than me, roughly the same age. His name is Victor Kaminsky from Canada. And we had played a really long, interesting struggle and reached this particular king and pawn ending. And my opponent, whose last move, I guess we'll set it up with what my last move was actually. There was a bishop here, and I took it. It was a big trade, and my opponent has just played f5. This is a fun position that I'd like everyone to take a moment to calculate and see if they can't figure out white's correct approach in this king and pawn ending. Okay, hopefully you have taken a moment. This is not something that I wanted to end with this here as far as our king and pawn video series. By the way, this is our last official video, although there is a bonus video coming your way with one particularly famous example of triangulation in advanced opposition, and one of the most difficult king and pawn endings I know. So I wanted to save those for last and really kind of push everybody to take their king and pawn endgame knowledge to the next level. So that's coming next. But right now, I wanted to end with an example of my own of really kind of a comedy of errors. This was mistakes by both of us, and I don't think either one of us really understood what the right approach was here, and neither one of us was calculating the winning idea for white. And I found it on a second try, but only after we both made blunders that were changing the result of the position, which is kind of fun, right? Always fun to see blunders. So after f5 in this position, hopefully you've calculated and maybe you have some idea, but I'll tell you what I did. I played the move king to f3, okay? My thought was that on king to f4, king to h6, and making a simple move like g4, everybody would be traded. He would go back to g7 and meet king g5 with king to f7. Basically, there's no way for me to make progress here if I'm always trading and his king can come up. If I play h5, he makes a trade and his king beats to my pawn. There's no way for me to triangulate that either, because he can always wait on the queen side of the pawn, the f-file flank. So I decided that there wouldn't be any ability to make progress with king f4, king h6. I decided to play this move king to f3. I was waiting to meet king h6 with king to f4 myself, okay? With the thought being that on king to h5, g3, king to h6, that I had somehow gained a tempo. Although, as we learned when we first learned how the pieces move, pawns have the option of moving 2 squares as well as 1 square. Good job on that one, Danny, right? So after g4, f takes, king takes, we're in the same exact position. And I had calculated this whole idea to try to gain some sort of weird distant opposition. But as it turns out, just to clarify, if king to h7 is played, I can play h5. And now whether he voluntarily trades or lets me trade, eventually we're all coming over here. He'll be maintaining opposition, but I'll be munching, and as soon as he gets opposition, as we just learned, I'll make a move like c3, waiting on the position and thus regaining the opposition. So king h7 is a losing move, but king to g7 saves the game. On h5, once again, we can take, king f6, king g4, king e5, king f3, king d4, king e2, and after king to c3, I'm barely drawing on king to d1, but that I'm not something I want to play for anyway. So king f3, being the trickster I am, trying to gain opposition, turns out did absolutely nothing. And if he had played king h6 and then come forward, the position would be a draw. He should simply maintain these 2 squares, and either one side will blunder something and let the king come up, or we'll make a trade and everything will be traded as a draw, as long as he understands to go to g7 and f7. Obviously, for some reason, he also thought that I was a tricky person and believed that I was brilliant with king f3. So he decides to be brilliant on his own and plays king h7. He says, no, sir. You're not tricking me with weird opposition, right? I was like, yeah, you're a genius. I really thought that it was a great move. I was so irritated that he had played king to h7. Okay? And so I played king e3 going back, not realizing he had one opportunity to still draw the position, which was once again king h6. And on king f4, king h5, by the way, of course, the reason he didn't play king h6 is, of course, because I gained the opposition, as we're all learning that this is a winning opposition. Of course, I'm being completely sarcastic. It did absolutely nothing. But it showed that both of us were operating with some sort of dogma in our approach that if white was to gain opposition on king f4, it would somehow change the nature of this trade on g4, allow white to liquidate the king side and come over. But both of us were missing, of course, the simple idea that once everything got traded, the king can wait over here and never has to enter the h-file, as that line I gave earlier. There was no way for me to trick him. I analyzed this afterwards and realized that we were missing this idea, that there was really nothing to do. So when I came back to e3, of course, he naturally, we'll do it from the beginning again. When I did this and I made my blunder, he made his blunder, I went back to e3, not really a blunder because there wasn't anything better. He makes his final blunder by simply repeating, expecting a draw, knowing that he can't really win this endgame, and of course being brilliant one more time, avoiding my distant opposition, my diagonal opposition. However, after he repeated the position one more time, I rethought about it, realized that I wasn't making any progress, and decided to consider one more time the idea of coming over to the pawn. Now, the critical idea, if everyone's calculated it, this whole time might have thought I was really dumb. Now, I did calculate the line, and probably the line that most of you came up with here is the same line I calculated, which actually leads to a surprising draw. What is that line? Well, the basic idea is that you have to see goal positions before you start calculating long lines. The goal position I saw was that I was queening first. However, he would be left with a bishop pawn. If anybody knows something we covered, the bishop pawn, as long as his king is on either g1 or g2 close enough, is a theoretical draw. Even with an extra queen, I'm not going to be able to win the endgame if he's left with a bishop pawn. So I was calculating long lines of him liquidating the king side and ending the game with a bishop pawn. This was my problem, okay? And an example line might be like king d4, if king h6, king c4, g5, okay? H takes g5, king takes g5, chopalicious, bam, slam, jam, cram, mam, fram, wham, bam, jam, Jobo, Billy Bob, draw. Chekaruski, Chekalina Lashlamba, you may now agree to a draw. Buckle your seatbelts, right? So this was the critical line I had been calculating. His simple making progress, trading off the g-pawn, both sides queen. I queen first, however, he's left with the bishop pawn, and I was aware that I cannot win that position. So for everyone who just calculated this line here, this long, interesting line, seemingly, like, what is Danny talking about? We're queening first. What you forgot is lesson number 1. Always calculate your goal position. Don't take things for granted. If you go for this line, you're not even winning. That's the problem. So after f5, and we can make the moves that were actually played in the game. But in this situation, that critical line coming after the pawn on b4 doesn't work. At least I thought so, right? The other thing to be aware of is that coming forward with the king is not the right idea for any player who calculated this. Although you actually achieved a similar situation with the bishop pawn, one thing to remember is that if you have an extra pawn, stalemate tricks don't work. So in this situation, black is actually lost because of his inability to sacrifice this pawn. He has to go in front of the pawn, and white will simply come forward and win the game. So after our funny dilly-dallying, we achieved this position again, and I realized something which is a really instructive king and pawn endgame idea, and it shows you that when you're calculating things, if you keep going back and you're willing to be wrong in your calculation instead of assuming that your first evaluation was correct, you may see a new idea. And basically out of desperation, I only figured out this idea by process of elimination and desperation, but it's actually a king and pawn endgame idea that it was the first time I had ever applied it in my own game. So even though I had seen it before, it's funny that even if you've seen things, until you really calculate and apply it yourself, it doesn't really stick with you, right? So now, because I actually remembered this idea, because I actually found this idea of the board, I now consider it a part of my calculation in every king and pawn ending, and I never take it for granted. The idea was this, and this is what I found the second time. When going after this pawn, before we simply assume that everything is straightforward, white has a very strong move here. The only winning move is king c4, double exclam. Using the extra time, the fact that white has won the passed pawn first, using that extra time not to push the pawn forward, but actually to improve the position of your king. So all the obvious lines lead to a draw. But king to c4, followed by king to d4, and my opponent resigned. Neither one of, I don't think he saw it, and I didn't see it until the second time, but once I actually committed king d4, I had already calculated it to the end. I don't think he fully realized what was going on until I played king to c4. But at that point, he has no choice. He can play f4 or king g3. I'm reaching the pawn in time. These two pawns will be traded for one another, and black can resign. So a really cool idea to see this race position end, not with the most obvious end, of both sides pushing their pawns as fast as they can to kingdom come, but actually improving the position of the king, taking advantage of the fact that I achieved a passed pawn first by improving the position of the king. Either variation will lead to something similar to this. This is perhaps the most critical one. Black doesn't get there. He gets there just one move short because, again, the pawn's ability to move 2 squares. Don't we love that we learned chess and pawns can move 2 squares? All right, everybody. You rock. See you later.